E malandro é malandro, mané, mané. Pode escrever que é. Malandro é malandro, mané, mané, diz aí. Pode escrever que é.
Hi, this is Hiki with the Lost Samba podcast, bringing you the best of the Brazilian music online in the English language. Today we're bringing you the life of probably the last proper streetwise sambista of Rio de Janeiro. A guy who was from the favelas, for the favelas, who told its life in an unfiltered and raw way. The one and only Bezerra da Silva.
Malandro é o cara que sabe das coisas. Malandro é aquele que sabe o que quer. Malandro é o cara que dá com dinheiro e não se compara com o Zé Mané. Malandro de fato é um cara maneiro que não se amarra em uma só mulher. E malandro é malandro, mané, mané diz pra mim. Pode escrever. Malandro é malandro.
The 1980s were very challenging times in Brazil. There was inflation that ranged from 20 to 60% a month, not a year. Sometimes it ranged even 120%. And it confused everything for everyone. You'd go to the supermarket, everything had changed price. You had to rush as soon as you got your salary, you had to buy things. It was a very, very strange and difficult time for Brazilians. Within the time that it stayed there, more or less some 10 to 12 years, it's accumulated 16 trillion percent. That's a lot of percent. So while the rich, they managed to protect their money by financial mechanisms, for people who just depended on their salary, life was very, 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 very hard. In Rio de Janeiro, things were even tougher because apart from having lost the status of being the country's capital, right? This was in the 50s, but it was still suffering from that loss. The Cariocas elected Leonel Brizola as their governor. Nothing at all against Brizola. I voted on him. The thing is that he was a political figure who was set to be the president at the time of the coup, and the coup happened exactly because he was going to become president. He was a very able and charismatic leader. He really addressed the bad wealth distribution. He invested strongly in education. The problem is that for the military, this sounded like communism. And the only thing they had in hand when he was elected was to boycott Rio. One example is they didn't allow access to the newly discovered petrol reservoirs that they found in the Campos Basin. It's one of the biggest reservoirs in Latin America. And the Brizola government didn't have access to this. They wanted really to break Rio to show that, look, this is what happens when you elect a progressive governor. And the result of this were decades, literally decades, of economic stagnation. This obviously affected the people who lived in the favela and that were Bezerra da Silva's world. The time that all of this was happening were the days when drug cartels were huge. These were the days of the Medellin cartel, of Pablo Escobar, and because Rio was in one of the routes, Rio's port was in one of the routes of the international trafficking, the drug trafficking exploded, especially in an impoverishing environment. It became one of the main activities in the favela and in the impoverished suburbs of Rio. In the favelas, this changed everything. There were always, the little traffickers of marijuana. They made money, but they did not have the importance as they did when cocaine appeared in the market. Trafficking became more organized and it became deadly. In Rio, the first organized nucleus of crime was the Comando Vermelho, the Red Command. Now, initially, it was a group that was organized in the prison of Ilha Grande, the top security prison where they locked up common dangerous criminals and also political prisoners. So the political prisoners, they had an agenda of converting the proletariat into socialism. And they taught the inmates to help each other and the importance of getting together and organizing themselves and everything. And as a byproduct, they taught them how to rob banks properly, because all these guys had been trained either in Cuba or in Eastern Europe or even in Russia. So they taught their techniques. And what came out of this, when the political prisoners left gradually, was a very, very, very organized group that commanded Rio's crime from inside the prisons, because it's a certainty every criminal will end up in jail, and if they weren't part of this command, the Comando Vermelho, the outcome wouldn't be good. They could die, their family could die. It wasn't a good thing not to be part of this command. But then there was a Terceiro Comando, which was a dissidence, and they were constantly at war, right? There were territorial wars, so they'll decide, look, this hill here or this favela is mine. And if the other group said no, there'd be a war and the population would be caught up in the crossfire. So it were very violent times. The official numbers was that there was 1 death per hour, not per day, per hour in Rio de Janeiro. There were more people who died in Rio de Janeiro than in the Middle East. It was that bad. It was in this environment that Bezerra da Silva appeared. The 1980s saw big changes not only in the underworld and the drug world, it also saw great changes in music. Until then, rock and Brazilian popular music, they were on a honeymoon, right? With the Tropicalia, with all the artists that appeared after the Tropicalia. In the 80s, there was a divorce. Rock became more purist, and Samba also became more purist. They went like two separate ways, and there was no crossing. Rock, it started imitating what came from London, with the punk thing, and with the goth thing. So that had completely nothing to do with Samba, with Brazil, with anything else. It had to do with London. On the other side, there was a phenomenon of funk, right? Funk became a big thing in the favelas and in the impoverished suburbs. And also they didn't want to know about punk rock, about goth. They had their own culture. And funk, Samba, and rock, they were kind of completely different worlds that didn't intercommunicate. Bezerra da Silva, however, managed to bridge these gaps, right? Because no matter if you were sambista, if you were a rocker, or if you were a funk fan, everyone liked cocaine, right? Let's put it like this. The themes of Bezerra da Silva were all about this, about the drug culture, not the actual taking drugs, but the thing that you can get caught by the police, about the police watching you, and one guy snitching the other one, and you getting caught. This was common for the three groups, and Bezerra da Silva, he managed to talk about the theme in a very humorous way, and the three liked him. Surprisingly, Bezerra da Silva is not from Rio de Janeiro. He is from a favela, but in Recife. His dad abandoned his mom when she was pregnant and went to Rio. And in the age of 15, after being expelled by the merchant navy, he decided to go to Rio penniless with nothing on a ship, and he arrived there to look for his dad. That didn't work out. They fell out, and he saw himself abandoned in the streets. So his way out was to work in construction, and he made a living out of that. Thing is that he was a bohemian at heart. He had studied music. He was part of the Samba scene, the drinking, the women, the streetwise guys. And because of this, also probably smoking weed, he landed in prison several times, and he ended up facing homelessness, mental illness, and he even tried suicide. What happened is that the Candomblé Center gave him shelter, and there he discovered his mediunity, and Mãe de Santo said that his future was in music, and he took that to heart, and he abandoned construction. He managed to get a gig at TV Globo. He was in TV Globo's orchestra as a percussionist. Somehow, in this beginning of his career, he became friends with Jackson do Pandeiro, who was like a major figure in coco, rhythm that comes from the northeast of Brazil.
Aê, mas gemeu no tronco do Jurema. Aê, mas gemeu no tronco do Jurema. Olha aí, foi sinal bem triste, morena. Fiquei a imaginar. Será que é o nosso amor, morena, que vai se acabar? Você bem sabe que a Ema, quando canta, vem trazendo no seu canto um bocado de azar. Eu tenho medo, pois acho que é muito cedo, meu benzinho, pra essa moça e acabar. Vem, morena, vem, me beijar, dá-me um beijo, pra esse medo se acabar. Oi, falam que a Ema gemeu no tronco do Jurema. A Ema gemeu no tronco do Jurema. Menina, foi...
And if you hear both, you can see that there's a huge influence of Jackson do Pandeiro in Bezerra da Silva's style. Jackson do Pandeiro took a liking to Bezerra da Silva. He introduced him to several recording companies. So Bezerra da Silva recorded several coco albums, but that wasn't a very popular genre. There were people, immigrants from the northeast who lived in the favelas who liked coco. There were the favelas in Pernambuco and other states in the northeast that listened to coco, but it wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right rhythm. Being a musician in TV Globo, knowing all about samba and having a background in malandragem, he was in prison several times. I can imagine that he was not involved in drug dealing, but he knew all the places where the guys met, and he knew the mentality. He gradually shifted to samba, right? And he struck gold when he discovered the kind of a genre that was happening, where common people who lived in the favela, they wrote songs about their lives, and he started to record this kind of samba.
Olha aí, vacilão, você com revólver na mão, eu me herói. Ele anda rebolando até muda de voz. Olha aí, cá pra nós, você com revólver na mão é um bicho feroz. Ele anda rebolando até muda de voz.
Simplesmente tô dando esse alô, porque sei que você não é de nada. Quando leva um arroxo dos homens, de bandeja entrega toda a rapaziada. Acha bonito ser bicho solto, mas não tem disposição. Quando entra em cana novamente, vai passar lua de mel também na prisão. Quando entra em cana novamente, vai passar lua de mel também na prisão. Olha aí, safadão,
Você com revólver na mão, bicho herói. É sim, ele anda rebolando.
alô, Gil, olha o juramento,
Você com revólver na mão,
é sim, ele anda rebolando até muda de voz.
marcha do alto, samba de raiz, or whatever you want to call it, but it was authentic samba written by people from the favela about their difficult lives, the constant problem of the police, with drug consumption, the fear of being put in jail, the snitches, which are like a big theme in his songs, and corrupt politicians, corrupt church leaders, corrupt candomblé people. It was all a mixture that wasn't tapped until then, because the mainstream sambistas, if you want to call them like that, they wanted to appear clean. They didn't want to get involved with drugs or with what happened in the favela. They sang romantic songs or typical songs about samba, how wonderful samba was, but they didn't really touch the nerve of the people living in the favela. It wasn't for favelados, or it was for favelados, but it was a clean version. In the 80s, TV Globo did a new series of festivals, trying to relive the success of the festivals in the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. And he entered with a hilarious but macabre song about a dead snitch. It's called the Snitch Corpse, Defunto Caguete.
Onde é que eu fui no velório, velar o malandro? Que tremenda decepção. Eu bati que o esperto era hippie legal. Ele era do time da entregação. O bicho esticado na mesa era dedo nervoso e eu não sabia. Enquanto a malandragem fazia a cabeça, o indicador do defunto tremia. Era caguete sim, era caguete sim. A polícia apitou no velório, o dedão do canalha apontava pra mim. Era caguete sim, era caguete sim. Veja bem que os homens arrochou o velório, o dedão do canalha apontava pra mim. Caguete é mesmo tremendo, canalha malandro.
It was like a breath of fresh air, because it was making fun and talking about life as it actually was. It didn't win the festival, but everybody who heard it liked it, and you could hear it being played from the beach in Ipanema to the drug dens in the favelas. It was like a popular success among wise people. By then, Bezerra da Silva was in his mid-50s, so success came late in life. Because of his troubled life and his experience, he sounded very authentic. This made him a huge star, and after that first song, the Defunto Caguete, came a stream of songs written in the favelas, many hits that were listened by everybody, independent of them being a sambista, of them being a rock person, or them being a funk person.
Vou apertar, mas não vou acender agora. Vou apertar, mas não vou acender agora. Se segura, malandro, pra fazer a cabeça tem hora.
É, você não está vendo que a boca tá assim de corujão e dedo de seta adoidado, todos eles a fim de chegar demais. E malandragem dá tempo, deixa essa faquinha sujeira ir embora. É por isso que eu vou apertar, mas não vou acender agora.
E vou apertar, mas não vou acender agora. Vou apertar, mas não vou acender agora. Se segura, malandro, pra fazer a cabeça pior.
His legacy didn't stay only in the 80s. In the 90s and in the thousands, new generation of people related to funk, especially rap, came to the fore, and the themes were very close to what Bezerra da Silva did, and they all revered him. They re-recorded him, they sampled him.
Meu vizinho jogou uma semente conheço, isso nasceu aí.
Ele só respondia, não sei, não conheço, isso nasceu aí.
Mas foi pintando sujeira, o patrão estava sempre na jogada. Porque o cheiro era bom e ali sempre estava uma rapaziada. Os homens desconfiaram ao ver todo dia uma aglomeração. E deram um bote perfeito e levaram todos eles pra averiguação. E daí?
Did everything they could to bring his spirit into their songs. It is obviously no surprise that the top player until these days with people in prison is Bezerra da Silva. I challenge people to find a guy in prison who has never heard of Bezerra da Silva and who doesn't like Bezerra da Silva. He is the voice of this population, and of course there are many things you can say about drug traffickers, many bad things you can say, but there are people who were thrown into a situation where drug trafficking was the only way for them to make a living. These are people who would obviously prefer to have another kind of life, to have a proper job. But when the children, they get involved in that, they end up doing crimes, and they have very brutal lives. It must be said, his son became involved in proper drug trafficking, and his son was killed, so he became a Christian, and he at the end of his life he ran away from his past. He didn't want to be related to drugs or to drug trafficking, but of course it was too late. The song I'm going to play today is a very funny song, like almost all of Bezerra da Silva's song. It has a dark humor to it. It talks about the virtues of the malandro. It shows that deep inside he's not a bad person, he's just smart and he's trying to live in a dignified way. It's worthwhile singing. The translation will be on the bottom of the page, the subtitles.
Você que malandro não vacila. Eu falei pra você que malandro não vacila. Malandro não cai nem escorrega. Malandro não dorme nem cochila. Malandro não carrega embrulho e também não entra em fila. Malandro não cai nem escorrega. Malandro não dorme nem cochila. Malandro não carrega embrulho e também não entra em fila. Mas o bom malandro, ele tem hora pra falar gíria. Só fala a verdade, não fala mentira. Você pode acreditar nessa pá de otário metido a malandro que anda gingando. Crente que tá abafando, mas só aprendeu a falar. Como é que tá? Moro mané, chega pra cair. Como é que tá? Moro mané, chega pra cair. Eu falei pra você que malandro não vacila. Já falei pra você que malandro não vacila. Malandro não cai nem escorrega. Malandro não dorme nem cochila. Malandro não carrega embrulho e também não entra em fila. Malandro não cai nem escorrega. Malandro não dorme nem cochila. Malandro não carrega embrulho e também não entra em fila.
As a quirk or as some extra information to the rest of the podcast, I would like to add that in the bit that I spoke about political prisoners trying to convert common prisoners into socialism, I actually met personally and became quite friendly with one of the guys who did that. At the time, he was much older than I was. um, called Padre Alípio, Father Alípio. And he was a Portuguese priest who was in Maranhão at the time, at the beginning of the 60s, and he was completely appalled by the poverty that he saw and by the inequality and about the powerful people not giving a damn. And he organized what was called the Peasant Leagues, which were an organization of people who worked in the fields to defend themselves or to organize themselves against exploitation. And because of this, he obviously landed in prison when the coup came, and he went to Ilha Grande, and there he, as an ex-priest, he managed. He came across very well to the other common prisoners, and he was responsible for the beginning uh, um, of the Comando Vermelho. Unwittingly, of course, I met him when I lived in Portugal. I used to play. I used to have a band of Brazilian music, and he had a organization that had a kind of bar or a little concert hall where they organize parties for Brazilian immigrants, and they help the Brazilian immigrants to get their papers sorted, to find a job. So he continued being quite progressive or socialistic in his way of thinking, and absolutely pristine, cool, everything guy, like 100% guy. The other quirk is that obviously, as like most people of my generation, I had some adventures concerning you know cocaine and drug taking. I won't get into them, but they were pretty intense, perhaps in another podcast. Um, but the reason for saying this is that I went to drug dens in the favela, we call them bocas, and the atmosphere there was incredible. Very, very, very friendly. It was like a constant party there, at least at the time. This was in the 80s. I don't know how it's now. I've stopped with this since the late 80s. I'm completely clean. But the atmosphere, I really miss it. There was obviously always policemen, and but they'll tell you, look, you can't go, or if there were police, look, go through that, because they were all in the favela. So take this way, that you won't encounter the police, and but in there it was like a confraternization of people of the Zona Sul, where the rich people live, of the Zona Norte, and the people of the favela. It was a really a great and friendly atmosphere. And finally, I'll just mention this obsession with snitches. This, in my opinion, right? There's no study about this. I'd be curious to see if there is. But this obsession or this hatred for snitches comes from the time of slavery, where snitching someone could signify the person losing a life, losing a limb, or being severely punished. So the disrespect or the hate for snitches is deep. It runs deep, and that's why there's so many songs where they have to mention a snitch, and that he deserves to die. That there's no forgiveness for snitches. Well, with white people, this also happens. Among the wise guys, this obviously always happens. With Italian people, it also happens. But I think that with the people in the favelas, this comes from the times of slavery. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Now it's every 2 weeks. I and I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Aquele abraço.